So if everybody can do that. Good morning again, and I'm Laura Bryant. I'm helping Daniel Lansbaum. Hold on one moment. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now?
No,
You'll find out, no? Okay. You know how to work this?
the bikes just don't get very loud here.
All right. You'll realize now.
Yeah.
Helen was born in England in a little farming village in the southern part of the country. She's always had a strong interest in history and the Holocaust, and began her studies at Binghamton University after her family moved to this country in 2000. She received her master's degree at Stony Brook University in 2011. No. Okay. She is this better? She received her master's degree at Stony Brook University in 2011, and joining the Holocaust Center in Nassau County, New York afterwards, remaining there for about 10 years. When she heard about the opening of our new Holocaust Museum there, she said, quote, "This is where I want to be." And we're very lucky that we have her now. Helen will replace Dan Reich, and her title with the museum is Director of Education and Interpretation. She's in a particularly interesting area right now because the museum is undergoing renovation and will reopen in November. So I want us all to welcome Helen Turner. Good, I did most of it.
Let's see what I can do with the mic. Can you hear me? Yes. And my friends online, can you hear me okay? Laura, can I get a thumbs up? Perfect, lovely. So welcome everybody. Hello. Yes, my name is Helen Turner. I am the Director of Education at the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. I'm delighted to speak with those of you who are in person today. Thank you so much. You are one of my first live audiences that haven't been at the museum. It's really interesting to me. Wearing the microphone was like a flashback to pre-COVID when I used to give a lot of these kinds of talks. And to our lovely friends online, welcome. I'm really excited that you are joining us, I think, from all over the country. I think we've got about 60 participants online with us today. So before I go any further, first, some thank yous. Thank you so much to the Merowitz Center for having me. It's so nice that we are just across the car park and that we can pop over anytime. And I certainly hope that you will pop over and see us. I wanted to give a special thank you to Daniel in the back for helping me so much with the tech. You were very, very kind and very gently persistent in making sure that I responded to be here this morning. So I really appreciate it. And to Laura, who is online, who's working all the tech behind the scenes. Well, I'm sure we all know that's a high stress job to make sure it all goes well. So thank you very much. I also wanted to thank Howard Radar, who introduced me, and the Friends Enjoying Life, which I just think is a beautiful name, that you are friends enjoying life. Thank you so much for having me. And of course, to lovely Kent Hirschfeld, who is one of our supporters of the museum, and a longtime part of the museum family. Thank you so much. So yes, I am Helen Turner, Director of Education. It used to be Director of Education and Interpretation, but we made it a little bit shorter. So I think Director of Education really encompasses what I do. My whole job is to bring education to the community, both exteriorly through schools, teachers, the public, but also interiorly. I'm responsible for the education of the museum staff, of our volunteers, of our museum educators, and everybody who works inside our doors as well. But I wanted to start off with who I am. Oh,
You need to stand in front of the computer so the online people can see you.
yeah. Oh, sorry. All right, I'll stand in front of the computer. I'm just still walking around. Thank you for the tip. So I wanted to start with who I am. As Howard said, I was born in a very small English village. My graduating class was 12 people. And I wanted to show this picture of me and my grandma. So just in case we weren't sure, I'm the little one in pink. She's the big one in blue. And I'm wearing my grandfather's hat. And by the time this photograph was taken, my grandfather has just passed away. And I show this photograph because I think it says a lot about who I am. I am not Jewish. I lost no family in the Holocaust, and I received very little Holocaust education prior to coming to the United States. So why am I here? How did I get interested? And for me, so much of that is said in this photograph. So the woman that you're looking at in blue, she is Pat Turner, my grandma, and she was 11 years old when war broke out. She remembers hearing that war was erupting all over Europe when she was in England. She was making a chocolate cake with my great grandmother. And they're stood in the kitchen, they're listening to the radio, and she's stirring in this chocolate cake. And they hear, you know, we are now at war. And she was very frightened, but also kind of excited. She's 11. She's like, oh, we're at war. This is interesting. And my great grandmother turns to her and says, don't worry, I'll shoot you myself if Hitler crosses the English Channel. And to me, that moment of gravity, my grandma understood that something very serious was happening, something very frightening. And she also lived in complete fear that her mother would kill her if Hitler ever crossed the British Channel. She paid a lot of attention to the movements of the army. But she was really encompassed in the war. She grew up as a teenager during that time. And for so much of her life was colored by that experience. Up until she died, she could still take off all of her clothing and put it in the order, folded on her chair, that she'd need to put it on if she had to get dressed in an air raid in the dark. And so it really colored her whole experience of what the world was, the war. But for her, it was the war, not the Holocaust. My grandfather, the man whose hat I'm wearing, he also served in the war, as did many young British men. And he liberated Bergen-Belsen, a camp that I have visited. Now, as I said, he is deceased by the time this photo is taken. So I never got to ask him any questions or get to know what he thought or felt about those moments. The only thing he would say to my grandmother is that he would never forget the smell of the camp. He would never forget that kind of pulling up. He was a truck driver in the army, and just the smell that came from the camp. And it's really these two figures and these two kind of key stories that really got me very interested in history. So we all have stories that shape us. We all have things about us that are so monumental, such gravitational pulls to our personhood that we must pay attention to them. But this alone did not get me interested in the Holocaust. I actually learned about the Holocaust at a very, very young age. I was with a school friend of mine who's German, and we had learned a little bit about the war in school. We're very, very young at this point, maybe 8 or 9. And they're telling us, you know, that the Nazis, you know, the British were fighting the Nazis and the British won. We didn't need American help, thank you. Thank you. And, you know, we're playing this game that we're running away from the Nazis. We're packing a little suitcase and we're sitting on the stairs pretending it's a train and that we're running away. And my friend's mom came home and she asked us what we were doing. And we said we were playing this game, and she let us know it was completely inappropriate. And that Melissa was German, and she very gently explained the Holocaust to me. And she said that a group of people decided that another group of people didn't deserve to live anymore. And that it wasn't a game, it was a very sacred and difficult history. And those words and that very gentle explanation to my young self had such a deep impact. I felt that this was a story that simply had to be told. And literally from that day till this, I have pursued nothing else. I knew from that moment that it was exactly what I wanted to do, which in a big roundabout way led me here. As Howard said, I went to university specifically for Holocaust and genocide history, not once but twice, which according to my father would be a terrible mistake. Because how are you going to make a living? But that's what I did. And when I heard about the museum here in St. Louis, I knew that I had to be part of this extraordinary project. It's very rare that we build new Holocaust museums. So many of them were built in the 90s, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation. And that 90s kind of arc really takes us from, we usually start pre-war, we do Jewish life, we go through the rise of the Nazis, we usually focus on Germany and Poland, and then we move straight into the camps, liberation, and the American narrative. And this museum wanted to complicate that, to expand it and open it with new scholarship and new ways of thinking about the Holocaust. And that's really what drew me to this incredible space. So having been here for only 48 hours, I had a wonderful interview. I knew exactly what I wanted to do in moving here. I sold all of my belongings in New York and drove here not knowing a single person. And now I've been here 1 year and 2 weeks. And it's been an absolute privilege and a complete pleasure to be involved in this work. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. Next, please. So I did want to start a little bit with our history, with the history of the museum. Who in this room had been to the former museum? Oh, very nice. So quite a few of us. You know, I never saw that space. When I came, it was just a giant hole. I have a picture of me standing like this with my brother in front of the big hole on my first day of work. But I've heard a lot about the former exhibition, and exactly what it encompassed and who it was for. And all of my understanding is that this museum was built for our survivors, to tell the story of St. Louis survivors and that particular narrative, to highlight folks like Mendel Rosenberg, Ben Feiner, Hetty Epstein, and Rachel Miller, and to make sure that their stories are never forgotten. So here is a rendering. It's a photograph of the old exhibition and what it looked like. And you see, it was a beautiful museum. But everything I've heard is it was a little bit small. For our museum educators, it was a little tough with the sound. I know Kent can attest to this, but you could hear other groups at the same time. And it really just needed kind of a refresh. And I think that's where the thought really began, kind of refreshing. But then it became a complete reimagination of what we could do. And again, this is just a little bit about us. So the museum, the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center opened in 1994. Again, one of those beautiful 90s museums. It was started by a group of survivors and community members specifically to preserve their stories. And we have not lost sight of this core thread. Annually, we used to see about 30,000 visitors, 20,000 of whom were students. Our goal with the new museum is to double that number in our first year. And we will now be one of only 22 significant Holocaust museums in the United States. This is a fantastic group to be part of. There's a lot of Holocaust museums and centers, some of them one-man shows all over the country. New York actually has 7 Holocaust museums and centers. Missouri has 1, and it is us. So we're really looking forward to joining a very special club of Holocaust museums that are serving this country and beyond. And of course, our programs explore contemporary American life, what it means to be a citizen, what democracy means, and current events, all through the lens of the Holocaust. So we can go to the next slide. So when we're sort of rethinking who we were and thinking about this transformation, we really honed in on our mission and vision. What are we actually setting out to do? So our mission is to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to reject hatred, promote understanding, and inspire change. And our vision is that we want people to have a transformative Holocaust museum experience. The museum, it's not just about dates and numbers and figures. It's about human beings, just like you and I, who all have a story to tell, who are complicated and messy and beautiful and kind and funny and angry, but they're people just like us. And we really want everyone who visits our doors to have that transformation, that this history is not about people long ago and far away who have nothing to do with me. It's about me, because it's about our treatment of human beings. So how do we reimagine it? We reimagined ourselves as the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. And in that we would be a regional powerhouse, that we would bring people, students, teachers, educators, scholars, survivors to us, and also that we would reach out to them with who we were going to be. Next, please. So this is us. This photograph was taken maybe 3 weeks ago. So you can see where we are. We're very easily visible. We're the Mirror Center over yonder. And you're looking at the car park, which is newly beautifully paved, and you're looking at the front of the building. So that building, you're looking at, there's a lovely glass window in there, the whole lobby. You've got the museum exhibition, which is the old floor plan. But then we've also added on, we've added some great features. We now have a fantastic auditorium that seats over 200. We have a gift shop. We have great restroom facilities, which I know sounds silly, but when you're seeing that many students, the bathroom is key. And we also have our new facility, the Impact Lab, which I'll talk about later on. And in our lower level, we have a special exhibition room, which is where we can bring in rotating exhibitions. So we can bring in art and textiles and different stories, maybe military stories, female stories, all these different people and narratives that might not be highlighted so heavily in the permanent exhibition. We also hold the Jewish War Veterans Memorial, where they'll be able to be every Sunday. And we also have a full archive of both the Holocaust archives and the community archives. So we're really putting a lot into one beautiful building. If we go to the next slide. This is the floor plan of the exhibition. And this is what I kind of wanted to talk to you about today and really focus on. Because as I said, so many Holocaust museums were built in the 90s, including us. And they do that classic arc, right? Taking us from pre-war, rise of Nazis, Germany and Poland, camps, liberation. But we really wanted to complicate that. So when you're looking at this floor plan, it is nice and big. And I will move around a little bit. I'll come back to the camera, but I'll move around a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. But we'll have the introduction to the museum, which is your classic welcome, hello, how are you? But also we've added another layer. When we think about Holocaust education, it's not so simple as saying, walk into this museum and have this experience. You have to prepare people. So we operate under the ethos of safely in and safely out. Meaning I'm going to tell you what you're going to experience. I'm going to prepare you, especially if some of us may have served in the military. Some of us may have lost family to the Holocaust. Some of us may just feel a deep, deep connection or be very, very moved by what we're going to see. We need to be prepared. And that all happens in that museum introduction. Then that first circle, memories of life before, that's our introductory film. Again, making sure that instead of just saying numbers and statistics, like 6 million, which we know is the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered during the Holocaust. We say that number and remember that number, but also talk about the families that were lost, the people this impacted, the childhoods that were disrupted, the love that was so brutally assaulted. And how do we talk about that? And we're doing that through a beautiful film, which encompasses the memories of our survivors. Them talking about their childhoods, of going to the beach, of being taken places by their parents, of family businesses, but also of fear, as they heard about Adolf Hitler coming to power and how things changed in their countries. The next section of the museum takes us through everyday life. What was life like in pre-war Europe? So many of our survivors grew up maybe without running water, or living in very small villages, or having a very, very close-knit family. What was that like? What did they do for fun? What did they do with their families? What did they eat for Shabbat? So really exploring these kinds of family life. Then we move into the oldest hatred. What is anti-Semitism? For so many of our visitors, they're not Jewish. So introducing them to what is anti-Semitism, both then and now, is key. Because anti-Semitism, as I'm sure we all know, did not end with Hitler, but it continues in different forms today. As we move into the exhibition, you come through this wall, here we start to get into our Holocaust narrative. Now we're talking about a gathering storm, the rise of Nazism. How did Hitler come to power? Getting rid of those myths that he sort of took over in this kind of violent taking over of the government, but that it was a failed democracy that allowed him to come to power. How did that happen? How did he consolidate that power? Why did people vote for him? Why were people moved by Nazism and continue to be in some places? Then we go into fear and intimidation, how they took control, how the burning of the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, really solidified this moment of fear and terrorism in Germany and allowed Hitler to completely consolidate power as a dictator. Then we move to brutal expansion, the start of World War II, the beginning of my grandma's narrative with that chocolate cake, and how that war impacted so many people. It would shape the world, the declaration of World War II, and also America's reluctance to get involved and what that looked like and how they were working behind the scenes in different ways. Then we get to the back of the museum. This space over here. This is called the onset of mass murder in the floor plan, but we've actually renamed it. We're calling it the geography of genocide. Because so many people have in mind that Germany-Poland narrative of where the Holocaust happened. But we know that it took place all over Europe and looked very different in different spaces and at different times. New scholarship has really shown us that over 1.5 to 2 million people were killed in walking distance from their homes by something called the Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile killing units that moved into the east after Hitler broke his pact with the Soviet Union in 1941. The research on this, which is now really the headliner of Holocaust education, highlighted by books like The Holocaust by Bullets by Father Patrick Dubois and The Ravine by Dr. Wendy Lower, really look at this very intimate and horrific killing. That's part of the geography, expanding to the east. We also want to complicate the narrative of the camps. So many times people throw around the word concentration camp a lot. And I think they should be very careful in how they use it. A concentration camp is a specific idea, it's a specific space, not unique to just the Holocaust, but it's got some specificities to it. What was a concentration camp? How many were there? And there were more than just concentration camps. There were transit camps and POW camps and slave labor camps. And then also the death centers or the killing centers. These used to be called death camps. But recent scholarship has changed that language because then you've got concentration camps and death camps and they sound too much alike. Killing centers were set up just for the purpose of murdering human beings. These deserve a special place to discuss that particular narrative. So you can see the back of the museum, that central place is talking about so much more than just Auschwitz, which was the largest and most notorious killing center. It's talking about so many other layers of the Holocaust and complicating that narrative, really bringing us up to date in scholarship. As we continue further down, you can see unimaginable encountering the camps. This is where we bring in the American narrative, our American soldiers. Is anyone here a veteran? And I asked my friends online as well, you can raise your digital hand if we have any veterans in the room. First of all, thank you for your service. Truly. But you know probably a lot of these stories of young men and young women, nurses and female women, female military personnel were there as well, of encountering these camps, of having no idea what they would experience and see, and how they tried to deal with it, how they went from being military to literally being caretakers and caregivers and therapists, trying to help these human beings that they found. My grandfather was one of those men. He was 17 years old, encountering Bergen-Belsen in an army truck. And I told you, he never spoke of his experience. He only spoke of the smell. And I imagine, I didn't know my grandfather very well, but everything I know about him is that the experience was simply too much. He couldn't talk about it, which is often the experience with our veterans, with our liberators, that it is so hard and so heavy. And so they have a special place in our museum to make sure that their voices, their stories, their experience is also heard. Now that's typically the end of your Holocaust museum. If you followed our timeline in your head, you know that we've gone from 1918 to 1945, and that's it. That's where most museums end. But we made a decision to go further, to continue to complicate this narrative. And that's what's happening in the middle of the museum. Right here are all these lines that don't really seem to make sense. This is called the gray zone. The gray zone is a term by Primo Levi, a Holocaust survivor. And he used it to describe human beings and sort of life in the camp. Because he said it's a gray zone. We are a gray zone. Within the camp world, within the Holocaust world, and I would say our world at large, people are neither good nor bad, nor black nor white. We all live in the gray. In some moments, I can be the most fantastic human being you've ever met. I am so kind. I am so good. I will always do the right thing. But then in other moments, my ego might come out. My fear might come out. My bias might come out. And I might not be the best version of myself. This is the gray zone. Complicated people. So we've dedicated the entire inside, that core inside the museum, to explore complicated people. People like German police, German teachers, rescuers, survivors, liberators. How do we let them be fully and messily human? That's what we want to explore in the inside of the museum. It's a very unique feature to what we're doing. After that, if you turn the corner again, you're up in that top right-hand corner. Here we get to displaced persons camps. This is where our survivors go post-war. They have nothing. Many of them have lost friends, family, all of their money, their business. They have nothing. And yet they are determined to rebuild their lives. So many of our second generation survivors and descendants were born in displaced persons camps. In this moment post-Holocaust, people are eager to get busy with the business of living. They have babies, they become politically active, and their big dream is to get out of DP camps and for many of them, to make it to the United States. And of course, that's where we enter the narrative, the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. How did people come to St. Louis? If you're familiar with our old museum, you may have seen a suitcase by Leo Wolf, and on it says St. Louis, Missouri. This is because he had never heard of Missouri, and he wasn't sure how to spell it. And so that is the narrative of coming here, of being a stranger in a strange land, of trying to make a new world in St. Louis. And that takes us all the way to the end of the exhibition with those funny squiggle lines up at the top. And that's the power of testimony, where we highlight 8 survivor narratives, where you can click and listen to someone telling you their story in their words. Again, making sure we preserve those St. Louis voices. And we've got the end film from generation to generation. Again, making sure that we make sure we're not talking about just statistics, but that we're talking about people. So that's an overview of the museum, what we're looking to accomplish just in our Holocaust exhibition, which is the central part of the museum, but it's just a part of the museum. We can go to the next slide. Here's how we're thinking to reimagine telling this story. We have made sure that the murals that we're using, so the background photographs, they're life-size. I'm actually the size of many of the people in the photos. And it's so that you can, not to picture yourself there, but to get a feeling for some of these moments, especially in the rallies and thinking about the book burnings and the things that so many normal Germans participated in. We've also got a lot of interactive materials and spaces. The image that you're seeing, this is our propaganda wall. One of the big focuses of the new museum is to teach people how to read propaganda. Sometimes we think propaganda is like an outdated thing, it happened a long time ago, or we don't see propaganda anymore. But we all know that the minute you go online, the minute you open your Facebook, your Instagram, your TikTok, whatever it is that you happen to be using, you are plagued with propaganda. Everyone's trying to tell you something. Everyone's trying to manipulate what you think. And this wall really helps us look at how the Nazis used propaganda and images and fear and bias and stereotypes to turn people not only against the Jewish population, but against so many other persecuted groups in Germany. We can go to the next slide. Oh, we'll skip this one. We'll come back to it. Thank you. But now I wanted to focus a little bit more on that geography of genocide that we spoke about, the onset of mass murder and the final solution, which is in the back of the museum. Next slide, please. This is one of the renderings of what that space is going to look like. So you can see that we've got really the narrative that I spoke about of coming to the camps. That's what that big image is. It's just a rendering, but that photograph is used by us. About what arrival looked like in these spaces, about what deportation from ghettos looked like in these spaces. And if we go to the next slide, please. And here you can get a sense of the room. And I want to highlight the rendering that's on the back with the orange line. This is going to be a huge interactive map. So again, to continue to dispel that myth that the Holocaust happened in a very few places in a very certain way, this map will show every railroad line, every ghetto, every deportation avenue, every camp, every killing site, and every killing center that we can represent. And this is to show the totality of what was happening. And this part of it is to show the scale, right? People say, how on earth could 6 million people have been killed? And we can show the mass expanse of this machine. But it's also so that we can show complicity. The Holocaust could have happened without the participation of millions of people who were making sure the railroads ran on time, people who made sure that the camp operated, people who delivered food to the camps, people who helped design the barrack buildings that were shipped to the camps. It took so much to make this happen. And for me, that's really the key of understanding the Holocaust. We can look at the Nazis and the collaborators, the people who were the deeply involved perpetrators, and we can see them as people who lost their humanity, who committed tremendous crimes. But what about everybody else? The people that we might feel a closer kinship to, the people who did their jobs, the people who didn't pay attention, the people who were frightened, or the people who didn't care. And that, to me, is the crux of why we study this history, because we are those people in different moments. It is our job to pay attention. It is our job to care. It is our job to take responsibility for what we do and what we put out into the world. Next slide, please. And I think it's in that vein of thinking that we also created something called the Impact Lab. So the Impact Lab is a separate space from the Holocaust exhibition. And it's a space where we want to really dive into this idea of how do you take that lesson, the lesson of the Holocaust, that you have a responsibility, you have a voice, you have decisions to make. How do you apply that? So many Holocaust museums and other museums of this kind of vein, they tell you this horrific history. You feel very, very upset, very, shocked and in awe. You want to do something, they say, go forward, little one, prevent genocide, keep the promise of never again, and defend everybody everywhere. That's a huge thing to say to a 13-year-old, or a 32-year-old, or a 62-year-old. How am I supposed to do that? And that's the point of the Impact Lab. The Impact Lab is a space where we can explore, what does it mean to stand up and speak out? What does it mean to embody the lessons of the Holocaust? What does never again mean when anti-Semitism is on the rise and genocide continues to happen? And that's why we created this space. So the Impact Lab is broken down into 3 main sections that are all part of our mission and vision. The first is to reject hatred. This is where we have a section just on hate crimes and genocide. What are they? Sometimes people throw around the word genocide a lot. There's a legal definition of genocide. What is that? How do we decide it's a genocide, and who decides? So that happens in this space, along with hate crime. The only point of this section is to make sure that people simply hold another person's story. All we're asking people to do is bear witness to what other human beings have suffered. The next section, 1 over, is to promote understanding with something called the spiral of hate. Again, for those of you familiar with the former museum, we used to have the spiral of hate in the section of the museum called Change Begins With Me. And it's literally a spiral of how we go from bias and stereotyping to prejudice, to discrimination, to violence, to genocide. This is an important spiral. Genocide doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes words, it takes a feeling about another group of people. So we want to explore that spiral and how it pulls us down, but also how you can reverse it. We can see elements of the spiral in our societies today. We know they're there. How do we stop it getting further? And how do we push it back up? How do we change the direction of the spiral? When it comes to things like genocide, if I know a genocide is going on, we know there are several happening in the world right now. Let's take the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example. I know that genocide is happening. I am a Holocaust and genocide scholar. What am I doing? Now, I cannot really go to Burma, Myanmar and say, hey, everybody, I think we should stop what we're doing. Let's find a way to talk this through. We can't hurt other people, right? That's unrealistic. But I can petition my government. I can speak about it publicly. I can draw attention to it, and I can raise the voices of the victims and survivors. If I see things like prejudice in my community, I can do the same. I can maybe approach it if it's one-on-one. I can make sure that I speak to groups and to students and to teachers about how to deal with it. And I can challenge myself and the people around me that I engage with to think about my own prejudice. What was I brought up to think about different groups of people? What have I been told? And you should know, I know I mentioned, I'm from a very small English village. I did not meet a Jewish person until I came to this country. I did not meet anybody who didn't have this face, and went to my church until I moved. And that's the experience of so many students and visitors who walk through our doors. But what have they been taught about their own group? And what have they been taught about other people? And how do we dissuade some of those things? What's wrong there? What's not true? And then the final section of the Impact Lab is right in the middle there. It is inspire change. This is where we put everything that we've learned, these heavy lessons, into practice. How do we inspire change? We do that by practicing going from a bystander, which we all typically are. That's usually our default mode. It is certainly mine as a pretty shy person. And we transform it to active ally. Someone who can make a move, someone who will act in the moment. There's lots of different ways to act. In this section, we go through that you don't have to be the person who stands up and says, hey, that was a racial slur that you used. You can't say that in front of me. That takes a lot to say that, especially what if it's a friend? What if it's a teacher? What if it's a coworker? So there are other ways to approach that situation. For me, I'm not good at the direct confrontation. It's just not my style. But I'm really good at creating a distraction, right? Maybe dropping a book on the floor in the middle of a difficult moment. Right? I see something I don't like or something that's making me really uncomfortable. I can see the victim getting very, very flustered. I can drop my book, create a distraction, make eye contact with them and say, okay. So there's different ways that we can act in different scenarios. And this part of the Impact Lab lets us explore those and practice those. How do I respond to anti-Semitism? How do I call it out? This is a very practical part of the experience. And then all around the room, you can see it written there, is active allies. The room hosts life-size murals of people who have spoken out and continue to speak up in moments of prejudice and hate and violence. And they're from all different walks of life. And they're messy and they're human and they're complicated, but they're doing the work that we all need to do to make our world a better place. Next, please. And finally, sort of the crown jewel of our museum is going to be our library, our archives, and our research area. We don't want to simply be somewhere that brings in just students. We want to bring in students from all walks of life at all different levels. We want to bring in the top scholars. We want to tap into the scholarship that we have right here. We have some incredible scholars in our community at Webster, at WashU, doing wonderful work. We also host an incredible archive, which is our literal connection to the stories of the past and those that we are seeking to tell the stories of. And then next slide, please. But I've given you a lot of information, a lot of kind of dry information. And so I wanted to end with something deeply personal to me. This is a child's shoe. It's going to sit in the main exhibition in that geography of genocide section. I haven't held this one, but I've held a very similar one to it. It's about the size of the palm of my hand. And this shoe was found at a killing site. We know that it was worn by a child. And we know from the provenance and how we received this shoe that it was very close to the gas chambers. And the thing about this shoe that always kind of brings me back to why I do what I do is that no matter how much research I conduct or interviews I listen to, books I read, seminars I take, or degrees that I get, I will never know the name of the person who wore this shoe. They were a child. There is no known record of them because of an idea of hate, because of silent bystanders, because of an inactive international community. Completely erased. And so my job every day is to tell this person's story, to tell all of their stories. Because as the poem says, we are the shoes. We are the last witnesses. We are shoes from grandchildren and grandfathers, from Prague, Paris, and Amsterdam. And because we were only made of stuff and leather, and not of blood and flesh, each one of us avoided the hellfire. And it's my job to tell that story. And I hope your job to bear witness to it. So thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I cannot wait to welcome you inside of our doors. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, for a wonderful talk. Very moving, and I'm sure we all enjoyed hearing it. She will take some questions, so go ahead.
Mr. Kent.
One thing that many of you may know is that the state of Missouri recently passed a bill, and I think we're now one of what, Helen, 22 states in the country
Yes.
mandating Holocaust education. There will be a week of Holocaust education mandated throughout the state of Missouri. Helen sits on the Missouri Holocaust Commission and be part of the group that put that educational package together. My question is, to what extent will what you do segue into what, the kids learn, because they're mandated to learn? How will that segue into the museum and our exhibits? How do you plan to kind of make it so that when they come to the museum after having had this week of education, assuming that that's the sequence, that it makes it a lot better experience for them?
That's a great question. So as Kent said, there is now a Holocaust mandate. The pilot is this year, so 22 into 23, and then it will launch statewide the following year. And I'm going to see the museum being a key contributor to that education bill. In that, as Ken said, I sit on the Holocaust Commission Education Committee, and I'm responsible for helping create the curriculum. And so what we're really looking at is what's helpful in Holocaust education. This is mandated grades 6 through 12. But to me, that says you need a variety of different experiences. A 6th grader at 13 needs something very different than a 17-year-old. And so the way I see it is that, number one, visiting the museum could be part of that week. Having a speaker from us could be part of that educational week. But also because we are part of creating that curriculum, we're going to really weave it into our exhibitions. If you want to learn about resistance, click here and you can hear one of our survivors speaking about resistance. We can really highlight that in our tour. So for me, I see them really going completely hand in hand, because this is an extremely unique opportunity. I'm coming from New York, which had a Holocaust mandate, and it was not very well thought out. And it's fantastic and really interesting and exciting to be on the ground floor of this mandate, which I don't like the word mandate, strong suggestion is better, but that we really want to help teachers and not place a burden on them, but to be their friend in this. And I know it's a difficult history to teach. It's overwhelming. Sometimes there's pushback to teaching it. And I see it as being a complete partner all the way through. Yes, sir. Very nice and loud, please.
It's been 77 years, the end of World War II. We've used slogans like never again. We have wonderful museums all over the world. Yad Vashem in Israel, Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and other cities around the U.S. States have passed laws mandating Holocaust education. And yet, you hear the slogan, Jews will not be racist. Synagogues are targeted like Pittsburgh. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Are we preaching to the choir? Are we missing the people who really need Holocaust education? How do we tamp down anti-Semitism in particular, but on bias and discrimination and hatred in general?
Fantastic question. So just for our folks online, I want to make sure that you can hear. The question was, we have a lot of Holocaust education, a lot of Holocaust museums, and yet we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism and in hate crimes and a lack of Holocaust education or awareness. So are we preaching to the choir? And how do we solve this problem? So my answer to that is a complicated one, because I'm not sure I have an answer, but I do have a theory of approach. And I think, so 1993 is called the year of the Holocaust. It's when so much happened in Holocaust education. You had the creation of a national Holocaust museum in this country, which in and of itself is very incredible. The Holocaust did not happen here. And yet we put government dollars to creating a museum on the National Mall to talk about this event. So that says that our country feels it's important. So this is all happening in the early 90s. You got Schindler's List. You've got all these Holocaust museums popping up. As I said, we were formed in 1994. So this is all happening in the 90s. We're now almost 30 years out. And in my opinion, we've sort of missed that apex of Holocaust education. There was a recent study done by the Claims Conference, and it had terrifying statistics about what millennials and Gen Z know about the Holocaust. I have some problems with the survey. I don't think they asked very good questions. But I think the overall message was Holocaust education is failing. So what are we doing wrong? And a lot of my feeling is we have to make the Holocaust relatable. The story itself is a Jewish narrative, but it's not about Jewish people. It's about people. It's about what we do to one another. Anti-Semitism is one form of hate, and you have to make it relatable. You have to say this happened to a human being like you, someone who liked ice cream and had siblings and was in love and wanted to go to university, and look what happened to their world because of hate. And you have to be able to do that in a way that connects every human being to the story that you're telling. So I think that's number one, you have to be relatable. Number two is you have to make Holocaust education accessible and to do what it's supposed to do. So many teachers I meet, we talk about Holocaust, I talk about Holocaust education all the time. And the main thing they've done is read Anne Frank. Now, Anne Frank is a wonderful book. It's an extraordinary diary, and she's an extraordinary person. But I think she's misused. So many of her quotes are about the goodness in people, and she truly believes that people are good. She wrote that before she was in Bergen-Belsen. She wrote that before her family was killed. We're only getting a portion of her story. And she's used as this kind of beacon, but we're not telling the full story of what happened to Anne Frank. We need to tell the rest of the story. We need to go fully into the gravity of the camps, the gravity of what human beings experienced. We need to look at more of the Holocaust by bullets, the killing of human beings by their neighbors in walking distance from their homes. So I think it's making sure that we're doing what we want to do with Holocaust education, which for me is really looking at the choices of human beings, the gravity of what really happened, and also making sure that for the Holocaust to happen, many systems were in place. You had to have democracy fail. You had to have railroad lines in place. You had to have a system to make this work. So I think those things combined are helpful. And as it goes to preaching to the choir, that's why I think the mandate will help. Because teachers who maybe do not want to teach this, schools who typically ignore it, students who maybe have no idea what it is, are now going to have to engage. But I think as part of the Holocaust Education Commission, we need to make sure that they engage responsibly and with the best educational tools that they can. But I feel your frustration. I'm right there with you. Kent?
To further that, you say preaching to the choir, but 90%, maybe my numbers are a little off, of the people that visit our museum aren't Jewish.
This is true.
Most of the students who come from the 5, 6, 7 states around us aren't Jewish. They are not the choir. So we have an opportunity to engage them and teach them. There's some amazing stories, and maybe Helen heard some of them, of letters that we have gotten over the years of kids that have come to the museum and were totally transformed, and they've gone back and impacted family members that were very, very right-wing. And that's what we have to continue to do.
Yeah, I agree. So just for our folks online, Kent was saying that most of our visitors to the museum are not Jewish. Most of the visitors to the museum are not Jewish. And it's really making sure that we reach those folks and they take that story home. No questions? Daniel, I do want to check. Do we have any questions from online?
We're good.
Okay, we're good. All right. Anybody else in the room? Anything you're curious about? I did see a hand.
Yes, I'd like to, just to share with you that if you need a volunteer, for 10 years, I have been volunteering and inspiring intergenerational kids for the Jewish organization in New York called The Road. I am a native New Yorker who had the blessing of 17 years of living in the Show Me State. So these are sacred grounds for me. And now fast forward 40 years after Albert Einstein said, imagination is everything. It is a preview of life's coming attractions. So I will give you my card. And if I'm free as a voiceover artist, and they call me the white man's James Earl Jones, or the voice of God, I will be happy to inspire Christians or Jews about what it is and be proud of being a Jew.
Oh, thank you very much. It's fantastic. And you bring me to a wonderful point.
I can't,
oh.
I couldn't hear you, my hearing aids are not gonna be ready until the 11th.
Oh, yeah. I said, thank you so much. I would love to take your card and to speak with you.
Give you a card.
Thank you. But also you bring up a fantastic point. If anybody here is looking to volunteer, we are actively recruiting. We have many different levels of volunteership. We're looking for visitor services, people who say hello, people who welcome people in, people who help us take tickets. We're looking for museum educators, people like Kent, who take our groups around and share the history of the Holocaust with our visitors of all different age levels, and we give a full training for that. We're looking for Impact Lab facilitators to talk about bias and stereotypes and hate crimes. Again, we'll teach you everything you need to know. And of course, we're looking for speakers. If any of you have a story to tell, perhaps it's of liberation, perhaps it's of a relative who is a liberator, perhaps it's of a relative who was a survivor. We need your voice. So please do get in touch. Daniel, I saw a hand raised.
Yeah, we had a question from the chat. Are there plans to have a significant section on anti-Semitism in the US, especially in the 30s and 40s, as well as verbal images on the fake militants like myself?
That's a great question. So for those of us online, the question is, will we have a section on anti-Semitism in the US, particularly in the 30s and 40s? So truthfully, we have a large section on the history of anti-Semitism, which is a long one. But throughout the exhibition, we show St. Louis responses to the Holocaust. So we have images, we've got them from Post-Dispatch, of Nazi rallies in Forest Park. So talking about our own local history and battles with anti-Semitism and support of Nazi Germany. But what I actually think, to the person's question, I would love to do an exhibition just on American anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s and today. Anti-Semitism has taken many, many forms. There's a fantastic book called The Longest Hatred. And it really goes into the different levels of anti-Semitism, whether it's religious, whether it's racial, which was the Nazi version of anti-Semitism, economic, political, there's all different levels to it. And so while it is in the exhibition, I would say it's not a core component. I would love to explore it in a special exhibition dedicated to the topic. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I have more of a practical question. How are we ensuring security both with people attending and the property itself? Are we making arrangements for that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So for everybody online, the question was about security and how are we securing it. So if you've got this picture up front, where those glass doors are, those are all bulletproof, and it takes you into a security vestibule where there will be a full X-ray machine, a scanner. So every human being that comes into the building will have to go through that security process, just like at the airport. And then the lovely benches and the billiards right there at the front, those are to stop anything driving into the building. But we'll also have a full security team, and we're part of the community security of Jewish Federation. And I should mention, I know there was an article in The Light on Monday about us separating from the Jewish Federation. This means that we're going to be an independent nonprofit 501c3, but it does not mean that we will lose our beautiful relationship with JFed, who really has, created what we're able to do. And so we'll have a very close relationship with them and all of our community partners in both security, but also goals and missions and values and who we are and the story we're telling. So security has been a top priority. Anybody else? All right. I think with that, it must be time to eat. Thank you all so much. This was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it. Hope to see you at the museum.